Hello and welcome to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Tonight I'm with a very special guest. My guest tonight is Christakis. He's a professor at Harvard. He's a professor actually at many departments. He's a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, but he's also a professor of sociology. And Nicholas has found an amazing way of actually combining his interest in medicine with his interest in sociology. In fact, personally, I like to say that Nicholas is one of these doctors that actually studies health, but from the skin out, not from the skin in. He doesn't focus so much on organs, he doesn't focus so much on another aspects that are internal, but actually on these more social aspects of medicine. And I've known about your work, but I actually never know how you got started, how this interest of studying the social aspects of medicine and health came to be.
So, I originally, clinically, I was interested in caring for people who are seriously ill and dying. So I spent many years as a hospice doctor as my clinical practice. After I did my medical training and my PhD training, my initial appointments were at the University of Chicago, and I was a hospice doctor. And during that time, I became very interested in the widowhood effect. So I had done a bunch of other work before on prognosis and on how to improve end-of-life care and on physician decision-making. And I became very interested in how the illness or death in one person can contribute to or cause illness or death in other people. And how when I die, my wife's risk of death goes up, for example. And this is actually an old topic in the social sciences. It was first described actually in 1858 by a guy by the name of Farr. There was some previous work in the 18th century, in the mid-1700s, by a mathematician actually, which was questioning how good is it, because in those days they thought that monks and nuns lived longer, and that it was a holy state to not be connected to other people, to be solitary. And then the mathematicians began to do some work, and they said, actually, it looks like the nuns and the monks didn't live longer. In fact, they lived less long. And so then people began to wonder, well, is it actually the case that the marital state, being married to someone, prolongs your life? And so then this statistician, mathematician, did some work far in the mid-1850s, and he looked at a whole country's worth of data, and he found, in fact, that widows die at higher rates than married people. So then this started a whole industry for 150 years in which people began studying the widowhood effect. And there was a stream of papers, and some important papers in the 1960s came out as well. And in fact, very early on, it's a topic I suspect we'll come back to, very early on, the mathematicians who were studying this effect or this phenomenon said, well, there are a couple of possibilities here. Either being married makes you healthy, or being healthy makes you married. So the only people that are unable to get married are the unhealthy or poor ones. And so being unmarried is a marker for those traits, and that's what's killing you. Not that being married is improving your health. So this is the difference between a causal effect and homophily. So maybe it's the tendency of the well to become married, not of the married to become well. So very early on, people identified this effect, and somewhere in the next century, people added an additional effect. They said, well, maybe the reason when you die, your wife's risk of death goes up is that you're both hit by lightning at the same time, and your wife just dies a few seconds after you, or you're both struck ill in some other way. And this is, of course, the problem of confounding some other factor that makes you both die at once. Anyway, so all of this was studied, and in the mid-1990s, I was actually working on studying the widowhood effect as part of in my lab, and I was doing some small projects in this regard. And I had been trained to study social networks as part of my PhD training, previously in the early 1990s. And as you know, in the mid-1990s, there was a big sort of efflorescence of interest in network science. A lot of physicists started moving into. Laszlo published some of his papers. Duncan published some of his papers. Mark Newman published some of his papers. And I was reading those papers and also caring for patients. And one day I had this experience, which I talk about a lot, which is that I was caring for a woman who was dying of dementia, and she was being cared for not by her husband, but rather by her daughter. And one day I went to visit them, and the daughter was exhausted from caring for her mother, and the daughter's husband had become sick as a result of his wife's exhaustion. And after I left the home that day, I was driving home, my phone rings, and it was the husband's best friend that was calling me because he was worried about his friend. So here we had a situation in which the illness in one person spreads from the mother to the daughter, from the daughter to her husband, and from the husband to the friend. And so I suddenly had two very simple observations. First, that the widowhood effect wasn't restricted to husbands and wives. It could involve other sorts of pairs of individuals. And second, that it wasn't even restricted to pairs of individuals. It could spread, across these tetrads, from one to another and so forth. And that combined with the work I was reading that was being done by these other social scientists and by these physicists, I suddenly realized that what I had been studying, these husbands and wives, were a special case of social networks. They were a dyad, right? The simplest kind of network you could have. And so, and I suddenly realized that I could study and understand much broader effects, that I could, if I could, collect data, we could study social network effects and the spreading processes within networks as relates to health much better. And then around 2001, I moved to Harvard University, and very soon thereafter I met James Fowler, who's become my closest friend and one of my closest friends, and with whom I've done most of the work on social networks. He's a political scientist and now also professor of medical genetics at UCSD. And James and I have been working together pretty much since then. And we began, as you know, to do a bunch of papers looking at spreading processes on networks, and then eventually other work as well.
So that's what I would like to go next. I know that you have been looking at the spreading processes. So you started with the dyad, you started with the husband and the wife, and how the burden of a disease can affect the health of a partner, and then subsequently to more people. So then that was an effect that, as you mentioned, was known. William Farr had studied it a long time ago, but at the same time there was kind of like memes going on that there might be other epidemics going on in America. And I would say that many people would think that probably you were the ones that kind of like started to bring data into that idea. What were those?
Well, I think what we were able to do that was something James and I are proud of is we were able, first of all, to get a new kind of data that had longitudinality to it. So there had been a lot of work done on structural analysis of networks, looking at the determinants of the topology of networks. And there had been a lot of work looking at what I would describe as static photographs of networks. But we wanted a kind of data which had sequential images of the network structure. So we had information about who was connected to whom across time. Here's your wife and your friends and your coworkers today. Next year, you might have a different set of individuals. And the following year, still another different set of individuals. And we also wanted information about the attributes of all those individuals. And data like that were very scarce, if non-existent, when we began to do this work, at least in health. I think more generally. So one of the ways I describe it is it's like the difference, it's like trying to explain the game of cricket to somebody. It's the difference between having a photograph of a cricket match versus a movie of a cricket match. Now, cricket is very difficult to explain anyway. I mean, it's a difficult game to understand, at least to me. But it's much better and easier to explain it to someone if you have a movie of the game than if you just have a photograph of the game. So what we needed is we needed movies of networks. We needed the ability to study networks across time, especially if you were going to try to make claims about spreading processes on networks. We need to have repeated measures. And so we were able to, through a sequence of serendipitous events, get some very special data that allowed us to begin to study it. And since then, of course, there's much more data now. We also have analyzed many other data sets, and other people have analyzed many other data sets. And so now that kind of data is much more prevalent. And we also were very interested in trying to study a problem that we thought was important. Actually, we chose obesity. So James and I began this work in, I don't remember exactly, 2002 or something. We started applying for the grant, and we started building the data set probably 2004, 2005, and eventually published the first paper in 2007. We chose obesity for a number of reasons. First, we knew it was an important public health problem, but that actually was not our main reason. Our main reason was that we wanted something that had appealing measurement properties. Because we knew we were doing something innovative, we didn't want to be criticized for people reporting their own traits. For example, let's say we had begun with smoking and we weren't measuring people. There are blood tests you can do for smoking, but let's say we interviewed people, say, do you smoke, do you smoke, do you smoke? We ask all these people if they smoke. Maybe people would falsely report their smoking depending on what their friends were doing. Or maybe they would falsely report their smoking depending on where they were in the network. Maybe there'd be an association between what you say about your smoking behavior and these other factors. So this would be something known as endogeneity. It would be an endogenous problem. So we wanted something that we wouldn't be criticized for that. We didn't actually think that was a problem, but we wanted to start with something which, first of all, was very objective. So in our data, original data, all the weights and heights for the patients were obtained by doctors and nurses. So patients came in, they were sat on a scale, their height was measured, very objective, first. Second, we wanted something which, for statistical reasons, was roughly normally distributed. We wanted something that nice, appealing, that was a smooth distribution. And something like smoking, if you either code it as yes or no, or you can code it as the number of cigarettes, but it has a different type of distribution. And so obesity was very appealing for that reason as well. So that's why we picked it, and we started with that in 2007, and then since then we published a number of papers looking at other phenomena, and then eventually started using other data sets and collecting more data, and we branched out from there.
So what's the main finding about obesity? What did you find? How were networks interacting with obesity?
Well, what we were interested in doing is understanding is, could we discern evidence for any kind of spreading process in the network? Could we discern evidence for, because it had become very fashionable to speak about obesity as an epidemic. Like over the last 10 or 20 years, everyone speaks about the obesity epidemic. And it was clear that obesity was epidemic in one meaning of the word, which is that there's more of it than there used to be before. So, we've gone from like 10% of Americans being obese to 20% of Americans being obese just in the last 10 years. Like from 20% of Americans to 30% being obese just in the last 10 years. And now about 2/3 of Americans are obese or overweight. So it's clear that obesity was epidemic in that sense of the word. There's a lot more of it. But we also wondered whether we could find evidence for obesity being epidemic in another meaning of the word. Could we see a kind of contagion in the network? Could we find evidence that obesity was literally epidemic, not just metaphorically epidemic? And so we wanted to see whether we could trace out cascades of weight gain in the network. So I gain weight, then you gain weight, the next guy gains weight, and it spreads. And so the first thing we did is we mapped these networks, and we found clusters of obesity within the network. So individuals, there was like these little outbreaks of obesity clustered within the network in particular topological niches within the network. And that finding, while interesting, is compatible with a number of explanations. One possibility is that people are affecting each other. Another possibility, which would be a kind of induction or a causal effect, a kind of spreading process. Another possibility is that there's just homophily or love of like, or birds of a feather flock together. So maybe it's not that obese individuals, not my weight gain causes your weight gain, maybe we form a tie because we have a similar body size, for example, like the William Farr example. So it's not that my health is causing my wife's health or that my death is causing my wife's death. Maybe it's that my wife and I got married because we had a similar health traits, okay? And the third possibility is that some other factor is making both of us gain or lose weight at the same time. We both live near a fast food restaurant, for example. Now, typically, all three of these are present in any social process, and the challenge when you're using observational data is to find statistical techniques that help you have confidence to what extent each of those is going on. So we used a variety of statistical methods. We also proposed some new ideas, this asymmetry test that we suggested, that helped us, and we had a bunch of evidence that to us was very consistent with not only the existence of homophily and confounding, but also interpersonal influence. So these clusters that existed within the network could not easily be explained merely by the operation of homophily or confounding. They also reflected the operation of induction or spreading process in the network. Now I should say, which of those phenomena is of interest to you depends on what your scientific question is. For some people, homophily is the thing that's of interest. Why are the good students preferentially forming relationships with other good students? And in that situation, it's a nuisance that one student's study habits might affect another student's study habits. You want to get rid of that to estimate what's the probability. Or for someone else, they're interested not in any of those phenomena, they're interested in marketing effects. So they're interested, how can we get groups of people to behave in a certain way? We want to broadcast into a network and get a group of people to behave some way. It's annoying when people who are likely to respond to our message are forming ties to each other. We need to get control for that and get rid of that effect. So each of those things can be a focus of inquiry, and the challenge, again, as I said, is to try to use methods that allow you to have confidence. And of course, ideally, and eventually, James and I started to do experiments as well, where we experimentally created networks of interaction, and we manipulated the interactions in certain ways we can discuss later if you're interested.
That's way cool. So then, I know that research has been enormously popular, and there has been many papers that have actually been validating what you guys have done, but there's other papers that have raised some criticisms.
Yes.
And I would like to ask you a little bit to explain what is the controversy about and what are your thoughts about it?
So So there have been a number of papers, a much larger number, it's true, a much larger number of papers that have been supportive of our work, either have confirmed our findings, sometimes even the magnitude of our findings, and also papers that have sort of argued that these statistical methods we use, that there aren't any better methods that can be used. There's a class of models that one could use called Siena models. The problem with Siena models, although we like those models, is that they don't really scale. You can only really reliably use them with smaller networks of 200 or 300 people. And plus, the Siena models, because you're always working with observational data, they involve certain statistical assumptions which are very similar to the assumptions that we've used. So they don't actually solve any of the main problems. Some of our critics have said to us, well, look, there's homophily could explain these results. It's very difficult to respond to criticisms without appearing defensive. And James and I are glad that our work is getting attention. And we also recognize this is the way science advances. And we're open to any suggestions about how to do the work in a different way. But no one has yet suggested a superior way of analyzing the data. So part of our concern with some of the critics is that they seem to be suggesting because statistical models involve assumptions that we should just give up and go home. And to me, that's a very nihilistic conclusion, and it would be akin to suggesting that, you know, we should stop observing the heavens with normal telescopes because we can imagine the existence of a space-based telescope. That, you know, because the atmosphere interferes with our observations of the heavens, and we have to make, you know, there's some flaws in these measurements that we shouldn't even bother. And you know, that's a bit of an extreme example, but that's sort of how I feel about it. I feel like we have the tools that we have. They allow us to observe the world with certain limitations. We've tried to be very open about the assumptions and limitations. Now, what are some of the assumptions and limitations? Some people feel that we haven't been able to adequately adjust for homophily. And I don't think that's the case, actually. And there's been a bunch of modeling work that's been done since then that shows that the kind of statistical models that we used actually do adequately allow for you to make inferences about the amount of induction present, even if those same models don't allow you to estimate the amount of homophily. Since we're not interested in homophily in this application, all we care about is that the models adequately adjust for homophily. Those models are good for us. First point. Second point, it's annoying when people say to you, look, there are these other explanations which you yourself are aware of. I mean, in all of our papers, we describe these phenomena. So I don't think the critics should get much credit for pointing out stuff that we discussed ourselves. You know, it's not like, you know. And then a lot of the criticisms also apply to all statistical models. So some of the critics' points have to do with certain assumptions that are deeply buried in regression models. And these same, if we take those criticisms seriously, we would basically abandon all observational statistical inference in any field. In the social sciences, in geology, where you can't really do experiments very much, in astronomy, you know, in any field where you observe the world and you use statistical models, some of the critics' criticisms are so general that they apply, you know, we would have to stop observing the world, at least with statistical models. So, you know, I think that, and then some of the criticisms I think have been helpful because, for instance, there was one paper that one of our ideas had to do with this asymmetry test. So if I say you are my friend, you could reciprocate the nomination. You could say I'm your friend. We're going to call that a mutual friendship. Or I could say you are my friend, and you could have no idea who I am, which I like to say is my experience in high school. I thought all these people were my friends, and they had no idea who I was. We're going to call that an ego-nominated friendship. And the last possibility is that you say I am your friend, but I don't know who you are. We're going to call that an alter-nominated friendship. So I'm the ego, you're the alter. 3 kinds of friendships. Now, based on social theory, we would expect that if we're going to imagine that you are affecting me, that there's interpersonal influence, we would imagine that influence should be largest in the mutual friendship. You and I are close friends. I say you're my friend, you reciprocate. There should be a lot of interpersonal influence there. Second, we would say that in an ego-nominated friendship, there should be an effect. I say you are my friend, so when you do something, I pay attention to it. I copy you. I model you. And third, if at all, an alter-nominated friendship. Here, you say I'm your friend, but I may not know who you are. you're gaining weight, but I'm completely unaware of it. I'm not paying any attention to you. So we should see a gradation in effect. If we see that gradation in effect, it helps exclude the possibility of the nearby fast food restaurant making us both gain weight, because the fast food restaurant doesn't care if I nominate you or you nominate me, right? So we propose this idea that if the influence flows along the vector, it's more consistent with a causal effect than with an effect due to confounding. So since then, some other critics have pointed out certain additional assumptions that are buried in this little story I just told you. And those assumptions are nice to know about, but they don't fundamentally subvert this idea. And in fact, even in those critics' own hands, they have to really twist the assumptions to get very implausible situations which would nullify this test. And there's been other work done by computer scientists which have also supported this idea. So anyway, so it's been interesting. I would have to say that part of what's motivated James and me to also begin to do experiments has been the appeal of having more robust causal inference when you do experiments. But the problem with experiments is that what you gain in the ability to do causal inference, you lose in verisimilitude. So experiments are very thinned out versions of reality, right? You isolate everything but one little parameter, and in these conditions, in these subjects, in this situation, with this outcome, you observe something. But critics could then say, well, that's not real. You know, like if you randomly assign people, as we have, to different kinds of experimental conditions, people would say, well, that's not how the real world works. So basically, science advances through a combination of observation and experimentation, and to the extent possible, James and I have been trying to, work in that tradition.
And now I want to move to like your more recent research, because you have gone kind of like full circle. You started, in medicine. That's something that people associate with something that is very internal to the human, let's say from the skin in. And then you move to the skin out medicine that we have discussed. But now, in a way, you have been looking at the networks, and you have been looking at the factors that are sort of like more internal to individuals that affect that network formation. In particular, you have a series of new papers in which you have been talking about networks and genetics. And I would like you to talk to us a little bit about what are these papers about, what are the main findings, and where do you think this field is going to be moving in the future?
Actually, this sequence of work, one of the things that I've enjoyed about this work that we've been doing is that it's sort of been unfolding in front of us. I have to say that I've had more fun in my life in science in the last 5 years than I had the previous 34 years combined. And it's been like a kind of discovery-based science that's been really exciting for me. And because each finding opens up new questions and requires new experiments and new studies to explore. And we've been doing one thing after another. So we talked a little bit about the obesity and the smoking thing. When James and I were working on that, eventually we became interested in all kinds of other things that might spread and that we could study with our data. For example, we became interested in human emotions. One of the interesting things about emotions is when human beings have emotions, we show them. But why? Why do we show our emotions? It's not hard to construct an argument from evolutionary biology as to why we would have evolved to have emotions, to experience internally emotions like happiness or fear or anger or disgust. But we don't just have those as internal states, we show them. And we don't just show them, but you can read them. And you don't just read my emotion, you copy my emotion. So emotional contagion is a very deep and fundamental aspect of emotion, the phenomenon of emotions to begin with. And so we first started by looking at spreading of emotions in networks, and we made what I think are probably the first network maps of human emotions. Since then, a lot of that work's been validated using Facebook and Twitter data. Other data, people have looked at spreading of sentiment and stuff. But I think our paper might have been the first paper that mapped networks in 2008, mapped networks of emotions, and we looked at a variety of emotions, again using observational data. But then James and I began to sort of wonder whether, because emotions are so deep and fundamental, maybe this was a bit of a hint as to the function of human social networks. We began to ask, well, why do people make networks in the first place? What's the deep origin of this propensity we have to make networks? If networks are so important and related to emotions, maybe networks evolved or arose for very particular reasons. And around the same time, we published a paper in PNAS where we had, partly motivated by the difficulties in making causal inferences using observational data, we took advantage of some experimental data that had been collected by other scientists, by Fear and Gachter, in a famous paper they published in Nature. We took that data and we realized that that data could be understood, reconfigured into the form of a network. And individuals in those experiments were playing public goods games. And we saw that, and then they were randomly assigned to play with other people, and then a bell would ring, and then they would play with new players, and so forth. And so we saw how my kindness to you in period 1 affected your kindness to the next person in period 2, and then that person's kindness to the next person in period 3. And we were able to find in this experimental network a kind of spread of altruism in the network. So this work with happiness, with emotions and other emotions, happiness and other emotions, and with altruism, which are both very deep and fundamental, started us to thinking as to why would humans make networks in the first place. And the thing about networks that's also very interesting, and most people, like you know this, of course, and most people know this, is that they have a very particular structure. Like when you look at pictures of networks, they always kind of look similar. And so we began to wonder whether there was a specific reason humans made networks that had this structure. And these structures are different than computer networks or than neural networks or than gene networks or other networks. And so we began a program of work to study now not the function of human networks, but the structure of human networks. And so we began to ask questions about the evolutionary biology and the genetic basis of human networks. So we had a series of papers on this, and first we looked at on whether we could find evidence that there was a partially genetic basis or a heritability for human network topology. And we found, for instance, that people varied in their tendency to have friendships, and that this variation was quantifiable, and they also varied in certain other ways we can discuss if you're interested. But eventually we showed that in a paper we published in PNAS a couple of years ago now, we showed that the topology of a person's network is partially heritable. Where you are in a network depends in part on your genes. Are you in the center or in the periphery? Do your friends know each other? How many friends do you have? And so forth. And then in a subsequent paper, also in PNAS, we found that there was an association between the genes, the genotypes of some individuals and the genotypes of the people around them. So people occupied sort of genetic niches in networks, and in fact, you are swimming in the genes of your friends. So your outcomes may depend not only on your own genotype, but also on the genotype of the people around you, and you pick those people as your social contacts. So that begins to provide a hint as to the basis by which evolution might act on human networks, creating these long feedback loops across evolutionary time. And then we began to ask a question which is, if it's the case that human network structure is partially heritable and has this deep origin, in an ideal world, we would love to go back and observe the structure that humans made, the network structure that humans evinced 10,000 years ago. Of course, we can't do that, but the next best thing is to try to find a group that live as humans did 10,000 years ago. So working with Corin Apicella, who's a postdoc in my lab, and Frank Marlowe, who's an expert on this population, we mapped the social networks of the Hadza hunter-gatherers. So there are only about 1,000 of these people left. Only about 700 of them live in the traditional way, about 400 or 500 adults. And Corin went to Tanzania. These people live, they have no material possessions, they sleep under the stars, they hunt and they gather for their food. They live like we humans did tens of thousands of years ago. So Corin spent the summer driving around Hadza land, and we made these big posters. We had a photographic census of all the adult Hadza, and we made like a Hadza Facebook. And we took these posters to the field, and every Hadza adult, we asked them to identify their friends in various ways, and we mapped the networks. And the astonishing thing is, by every measure we could throw at it, Hadza social networks look just like ours, mathematically. The same degree distribution, the same amount of transitivity, same extent of homophily and reciprocity, same decay with geographic distance. And then while we were there, we also measured the individual's propensity to cooperate, and we found, as hypothesized, a very deep relationship between human cooperation and network structure. And that paper was just published in Nature. So we have other ideas that we're pursuing. And so we have a set of ideas now about what we would regard as the deep evolutionary origin of this fact that we humans make networks. Because think about this. Why do we have friends? I mean, other species don't have friends. Other species live in groups, but we don't just live in groups, we live in networks. So I think it's possible to problematize or call into question the fact that we form long-term non-reproductive unions. We don't just have sex with other people, we befriend other people. And it's not hard to explain why we have sex. I mean, there's a long literature on this, and it's obvious. But it's harder to understand why we have friends. And we don't just have friends in particular patterns, with networks with particular patterns. So we've begun to think about this. We've begun to think about what are the origins of network formation and network structure. And that's what we're working on now. And in parallel with all this, we've also begun to do some experiments and some other work too.
That's very, very exciting. And so would it be okay to say that in some ways, we are kind of genetically predisposed to form groups that have the right diversity mix, that include people with the right set of genes, or with a diversity of genes that would allow us to do the activities that maybe we look to do?
I don't know what the answer to that question is yet, but I think it's very possible that what you said is true. We're actively investigating that. But some physicists and others have modeled, for instance, what type of network structure would be optimal to retard the flow of a pathogen through a network. And this will probably make intuitive sense to you, but it turns out that degree assortativity is very good, is very helpful when you're trying to slow the spread of a pathogen within a network. Well, we know that human populations evince degree assortativity. So maybe we evolved to have networks with particular properties because they make us as a group more resistant to the flow of germs within the system. So there may be a variety of structural features of human networks which are adaptive. We don't yet fully know what those selection pressures were, like why we might have the certain features that we do. But many of the features that networks evince, that human networks evince, you can make a good argument for why that is functional, why that's beneficial.
Okay, so I think I understand you better now. So it's not that just we form groups such that we get the diversity of genes, but actually that by having certain affinities to others, we form networks that have structures that would be selected for.
That's right. And that would be advantageous to all members of the group. Okay. That's exactly right. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, and this comes into like very contentious group selection, exactly.
And I think that's another
whole story. That's another whole story. I recognize that group selection is sort of a minority view. I'm not saying that there's no individual level selection. There clearly is. But I think that some of our work does provide more of a basis for understanding group selection, even outside the eusocial insects, for example, and the arguments that are being made there. So I think that because if you begin to understand that my fitness depends, by fitness I mean Darwinian fitness, that my fitness depends not only on my own genes, but on the genes of my neighbors, and moreover that I select my neighbors, and that we form assemblages with particular mathematical properties, then you can begin to see that my phenotype and my fitness might depend on the genotype not just of myself but of those around me, which provides a lever or a mechanism to have group selection. One of my favorite examples of this is work done by other scientists that's looked at caged hens. And they looked at the feather condition of these hens, and the feather condition of a hen is a very important phenotype in a hen. And they found that the feather condition of the hen depended not only on the genotype of the hen, so some hens had better feathers than other hens did, and it was related to the genes that they had, but also that the feather condition depended on the genotypes of the other hens that were caged near it. Yeah. So those other hens might be aggressive hens that are pecking on you, right? And that causes your feathers to be worse. So, and in fact, they found that your feather condition depended more on the genotypes of the other hens around you even than on your genotype. Well, what's interesting about that experiment, and then you could of course randomly manipulate that, what's interesting about those studies is that in humans, we pick the people around us, right? So
Except in jail, that would be.
in jail, but you could look in jail. That's right, exactly. That's exactly right, except in jail. But you could begin to imagine now a kind of broad feedback loop whereby we humans construct a social environment around us. That social environment is a kind of selection pressure. Look, the leading threat to other humans, the leading predator of other humans, has always been other humans. I mean, the main thing that kills us is not lions, but other members of our own species. So we can adapt to that pressure. The existence of other humans, they're a source of support, but they're also a threat to us. So this is actually one of the reasons we think that cooperation is also part of the story. The necessity of cooperating with others, of manipulating network structure to foster cooperation and to preserve cooperation, all these ideas are connected. In fact, we've now begun a set of experiments in which we are going at the other extreme, going from the Hadza hunter-gatherers, now we're using Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, and we're recruiting people online to participate in experiments in which we permit them to rewire their own networks in certain ways. And we find that when we allow rewiring in certain ways, but not in other ways, people are better able to preserve their cooperative spirit. And so we find that the structure of networks is related to the ability of a group to sustain cooperation. And in fact, in still other work, we've looked at the existence of innovation and still other properties. So network structure is related to all kinds of phenomena, not just health-related phenomena, but phenomena as diverse as cooperation and the diffusion of ideas and so forth. So it's a story, in my eye, that's still unfolding, really understanding the how and why human beings make networks and how and why networks work the way that they do is still a wide open field. I mean, I expect to spend at least the next 10 years working in these areas, and I'm only going to be exploring a tiny part, James and I, of the frontier, and there are many other scientists that it's a really cool area, in my judgment, to be working in. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and also the other whole thing is, one can begin to ask what James and I are calling the so what question, which is, okay, so you've understood how networks form and operate, so what? What can you do with that knowledge? And so we've begun a program of research that begins to try to understand how can we exploit this knowledge to make the world a better place. So one paper, which I think you know, is that sensor network paper that we did, where we showed that if you can identify central people in networks and monitor them, either actively or passively, you can forecast the future of an epidemic. Because the intuition is that central people are going to be more likely to get whatever's spreading in the network and more likely to get it sooner, so they should have symptoms of a disease well before the average person. So if you can identify central people and monitor them for symptoms, you can forecast that an epidemic is coming weeks ahead of time. And in fact, we demonstrated that this was possible with the outbreak of H1N1 flu a couple of years ago, and we also published that paper. But since then, we've begun to think about other things that you can do where you could, for instance, in the developing world, how could you exploit an understanding of network structure and interaction to enhance the ability of villages or groups of people to improve their health and their well-being. So for instance, could you target particular interventions like new technologies, malaria bed nets or vaccination or drugs of particular kinds or new seed technology for the farmers to use? And if you can map the networks of these villages, can you figure out who are the best people to target so that if they change their behavior, the whole group will change? Can you get a phase transition in the network by exploiting what you know of how they work? And so this is another set of things that we've been starting to do.
Cool. So then now to conclude, we always go and go a little bit over the life of our guests, you know. But in your case, you know, I just want to make a brief stop before that, and I want to ask you a little bit about data. You know, I always like to use the analogy that, you know, data is kind of like the flour and we bake cakes, okay? And you have had many different types of flours, and you have been using data of many different kinds, from the Framing Heart study to data on Facebook, to data on twin studies, to many different kinds. And now as data is being opened, I would like to get a little bit of your thoughts and maybe a little bit of your opinions of how do you think open data is going, and is there enough being done? Is there, you know, do you find it sometimes hard to find the data, even after you have been able to show all the amazing things that you are able to do with it? How do you see that? Where do you stand in kind of like this big open data?
Well, I have complicated thoughts on this. So, I mean, obviously, I have selfish interests in the wide availability of data. I mean, scientists need data, and I think we are in this era of computational social science. I think that, look, if you had asked social scientists 20 years ago what powers they dreamed that they would have, they would say it would be amazing if we could have a little tiny Black Hawk helicopter that could fly above every person and constantly monitor where they are and who they're talking to and what they're buying and what they're thinking. And if you could have millions of these helicopters that flew atop of everybody and every second gave you data, that would be unbelievable.
Nokia built those for
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And of course, that's the data we have now. I mean, we have the ability to understand. I think, without being too over-optimistic, I think the social sciences are on the cusp of a move that's similar to the invention of the microscope or of the telescope, what those did for biology and for astronomy. I think we have a kind of availability of data that will allow us to understand social processes in a whole new way. And this is coupled, of course, with the emergence of all kinds of mathematical innovations and computational innovations and hardware and software innovations, which allow us to analyze and study these data. And many brilliant people are moving into the field, and so you have a lot of smart people working with good data and good methods and good tools, and so we're making progress. But you're right. I mean, I think access to the data is very important. The part that I'm confused by is that I think, on the one hand, it would be great if everyone would voluntarily surrender their data. Now, that's not going to happen, or it will happen sometimes, but not always. I think one possible strategy might be to monetize the data. So if you gave, it's like the strategy when you have big slums in the developing world. One way to clean up the slums is to give people title to their land. So all of a sudden they have an asset, they have a deed that says this little plot of land is yours. That means they don't have to waste energy anymore defending their plot of land, leaving someone at home so that, otherwise people will come and take over their little plot of land. They have no capital with which to borrow against. So when you monetize these holdings, when you create, when you capitalize them, all of a sudden you can create markets and people can buy and sell their land, and you extract the value that was hidden. So I think one possible way forward is to begin to think about giving people title to their own data, and you pay people a little bit of money for the data. Or people say, you have a free credit card if we can analyze your data, otherwise you pay $50 a year, which you do now. And then we'll give you a free card because there's some value. I mean, the credit card companies and other people could have some value. So now this will create other problems for scientists because some people will have surrendered the data, some won't. But if we're worried about data being proprietary and worried about people keeping data secret, then I think we have to create different incentives to align open data with the public good and with scientists.
And probably you know very well about the work of Sandy and John Klippinger, Sandy Penna and John Klippinger in this dimension, which they have actually been, working with the World Economic Forum in developing, these private banks for data. So that's, and they have been developing the standards. We can talk a little bit later, I guess, about that.
Well, actually, another potential model is a model that James and I and Mark Pletcher at the UC system are also working on, which is a kind of, give your data to science. So like how you can give your data, you can give your body to science, to do anatomy dissection or whatever. Well, why don't we create a tool that allows people to give their data to science? So, for example, we've also been talking to Facebook about this. There should be a way for people who are in Facebook or other platforms to voluntarily say, yes, you can use my data. Go and sign up somewhere. And you probably get millions of people. In fact, this is part of a larger movement in the world of citizen science, right? You can have all these people. Earlier, we were talking about earlier, before we started taping, about you got 600,000 people to rate, all these volunteers. And you can have SETI at home where people look for extraterrestrial life, or where people look for the tomb of Genghis Khan, or they're mapping the heavens, or you have all these people volunteering to help. Well, many millions of people would probably voluntarily surrender their data. And if we created the vehicles and the mechanisms for that, and then we would have the tools that we needed to make progress.
And we would increase the literacy of people about data and what gets done with it, and what are the right uses or not.
Some ownership in it.
Exactly. So now just to conclude, because I think we have been having a pretty long interview, but it has been a lot of fun. I would like to go and wrap up by going through through actually, your history. Like this is a show that is seen by people that actually are not necessarily in academia like we are, and they enjoy learning about people like you, about your research. But also I think it's valuable for our viewers to see how did you get here. How do you go from wherever where you were born to being a professor at Harvard and working on the interaction between genetics and networks and medicine? So where did you grow up? Let's start there.
This story, we told a little bit about the last 10 or 15 years. My heritage is Greek. All 4 of my grandparents were Greek. My mother's side of the family came from Asia Minor, so they were Byzantine Greeks. They were from Turkey. The story's more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. My father's side of the family originally were from Crete, and it came from Athens. At the level of my grandparents' generation, they were very poor, actually. They were smart, but they were poor.
And what year was that?
So my father's father was born in 1897. My mother's father was born after the turn of the last century. And my father's father was orphaned when he was a teenager. And my mother's father was an economic migrant. He went from southern Greece to Turkey, just before the First World War. Anyway, those guys were all very interesting. They made some money. They saw fit to send their children abroad to be educated. So my parents came to the United States from Greece in the late 1950s. And they both came to Ivy League schools. My father actually went to Princeton and studied physics. And he arrived just after Einstein had died. And his dissertation advisor was Wheeler, his undergraduate thesis advisor. My mother came to Vassar, and she studied chemistry. And they met through the Greek community, and they both went to Yale for graduate school. My father in physics, in nuclear physics, my mother in physical chemistry. And I was born in New Haven, and so I come from a fairly academic background.
That's why you have a good heart for physicists.
Yeah, good heart for physicists, exactly. I know these people. But actually they went back, neither of them ever practiced those professions, which is interesting. And my father and mother went back to Greece when I was a baby in 1965 approximately. I was a young kid, I was 3. And then my father had to do his military service because he had deferred, And so he did his military service, and then there was the junta, the coup d'etat in 1967 in Greece, so they couldn't return. They returned to the United States in 1968. And at that time, I didn't speak any English. I just spoke Greek. But the rest of my life has been spent here. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and then I went to college in 1979. I went to Yale, and then I studied biology. And then from there, I went to Harvard Medical School in 1984, and I studied medicine and public health. And then from there, I went to the University of Pennsylvania in 1989. Is that right? 84, 89, yeah. And then I got my PhD in sociology, and I did my clinical training. And then in 1995, I went to the University of Chicago, and that's when we were talking earlier about how I was studying the widower effect and so forth. So, I think one of the things I enjoy most in life is curiosity, and the ability to satisfy my curiosity, to engage in some kind of discovery-based science is like one of the most thrilling feelings that I can have. And I think part of my spending so many years getting an education was the desire to know as much as I could about as many things as I could. And as you said at the beginning, I think that in some way, all that preparation was very valuable, because now I'm spending my career at the intersection of the natural and the social sciences, right? That little part that's right between, that's the overlap of the two. And so, and I think it's very gratifying to be in that spot for me and to have had those opportunities. So, I don't know. I think I think that one of the things that people don't understand is that a lot of the stories about science are true. You know, that it's a collective enterprise and that people are each making contributions, that there's a cross-fertilization of ideas, that the best ideas typically emerge at the intersection of disciplines, that there's serendipity involved, like dumb luck. We didn't talk about this, but we stumbled on the Framingham data. In a way we can discuss if you're interested, but there was some serendipity and chance involved in our discovery of these paper records, which hadn't been used for research purposes, that we were able to computerize. So there's interdisciplinarity, there's serendipity, there's tenacity, there is like the thrill of discovery and of the chase, there's accumulation, there is like the sense of collegiality, that there's competition, you're competing with other labs as well. I mean, it's a very, at least my experience of the life in science has been that it almost followed the stereotype, and that's what I wanted for myself. You know, when I was in college, that's the kind of career that I had wanted. So I feel very fortunate to have had it, actually.
And you have had a wonderful career. You know, you have contributed enormously to various fields, and we're very happy to have had you, you know, here in our Purple Couch on Cambridge Nights. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you so much, Cesar. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.